data that is not in panel ID. As we already mentioned, in panel ID, we're going to find a lot of data that's in the panel of a process. But of course, not all of the data is going to appear there. For example, we mentioned that a multiple selection field is not going to appear there. A prefix field is not going to appear there. So there's certain fields that aren't really going to appear inside of that table. That's called panel ID. So we already know that when we go to the table Procesos Clases, we're going to find the IDs of the different classes of process. And when we go to search for a table that's called panel and an ID, if the ID matches the ID of the class of process, we're going to find a lot of values, a lot of information there, but not all of it. So now there's an intermediate step we need to learn how to use in order to find certain values of certain fields, for example, of a prefix field. Now, let's say I go to another table, it's called Campos Tabla, and this table is going to be very useful to identify all the terms that are being used in the panel of a process. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is go to Campos Tabla, and once I'm in this table, I'm going to want to filter by the ID of a certain class of process. For example, in this demonstration, we're filtering by the class of process with the ID number 2. And by doing this, we can obtain all the different fields that are in this corresponding class of process. Now here we can see an example where I've gone to Campos Tabla, and in this table, I can see here there's a lot of IDs. Each one of these IDs is unique per each term in relation with a certain panel of a class of process or a certain family of records. But of course, we don't want to see in the grid the same term appearing several times related with the different classes of process, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to filter, for example, by panel ID 29. That's the example we're using throughout this presentation. If I do this, what I'm going to be able to see is a list of all the fields that are being used in the panel of the class of process with the ID 29. So here where it says Nombre Tabla, this is the column I'm going to use to be able to filter by the panel ID 29, or whichever other I want to use in order to filter. And over here, we're going to see the name of all the different fields. Besides, I can also see the description and some other information. So let's say here in this example, I'm filtering by panel 5. So I only want to see, or only want to display in this grid the terms that have been added to the panel of the class of process with the ID 5. So I filter, and by doing this, now I'm only seeing the information of that panel. Now, once I do this, I'm going to obtain these internal IDs. These IDs are quite important. We'll see later on why they're important. But before doing that, I'm just going to demonstrate this in the SQL database. So the first thing I want to do is go to Campos Tabla. I want to open this. We already know that all we have to do is select it, filter, and show the different rows. And here we go. Okay, so here I have all the different rows. Obviously here I've already filtered, but if I don't filter, what's going to happen is going to show me a lot of different fields. Besides, it's going to show me a lot of them even repeated. So if I filter by nombre interno, for example, and I look for a certain prefix, let me see. Okay, so if it's equal to maybe ID, I'm probably going to find several results. Okay. Okay, here we go. So we have this field with the name, internal name ID. We have it a lot of times. And besides, we can find it in all kinds of different panels. But if I say, well, I'm going to filter, so I only want to display the field ID if it's in a certain panel. For example, in panel 29, because that's a panel I've been using lately to demonstrate different options. So I'm going to say, I change this. So I'm saying where nombre tabla is this column here, is going to be panel 29. I'm actually going to not only display panel 29, but all these are the ones that are related to the panel 29. So here we can see all the fields. Now we can still see ID is repeated because we have ID here for this panel, and we also have ID up here for this panel. Remember we mentioned earlier that when we see panel and one ID, this is referring to all the fields in the class of process. But if it's a group of fields within the class of process, then we'd have another underline here and another ID, okay? But anyways, for now we can see we've identified all the different terms that we have in this panel, in the panel of the class of process with ID 29. Let me check here just to make sure. I'll go to panel, and here we can see the entire list. So we can see chronometer, see agenda, location. This is a simple selection field. We also have a group of fields that's called meetings. Okay, so if I go here to this list, well, here I have meeting. This is not a group of fields, but if it would have a number 6 in front, we would know it's a group of fields. Let me look for it. Here it is, okay? And it's in the panel 29. Okay, and then we mentioned that this has a unique ID. So for now, all we have to do is remember that the group of fields in relation to the panel 29 has the ID 2814. Later, we're going to see what these values or what these IDs are useful for.